Good evening, virtual visitors. My name is Shakia Gillette. I am the director of the African American History Initiative here at the Missouri Historical Society. Welcome to our program and thank you for joining us tonight. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our members, our donors, and supporters of the Zoo Museum Tax District. Thank you. As a part of our long tradition of working actively toward racial equity, and our commitment to improving and diversifying the historical perspective, we are proud to present to you the fourth and final keynote presentation for our How Did We Get Here? Conversations about Race, Anti Blackness, and Identity series. Many people have referred to the current climate as the summer of awakening. And in many ways, this entire series is designated to awaken and provoke you to see history in a different light. As the Missouri Historical Society, it is our job to provide historical perspectives on timely issues and cross historic, economic, and racial divides in order to tell stories of everyone who calls the St. Louis region home. I want to first applaud each of you for participating in this discussion. Tonight's presentation may feel uncomfortable at times, but it is important to create a space where dialogue and deep discussion may happen. We acknowledge that each of you have different vantage points based on your lived experience, but please utilize this time to listen to different perspectives and gain knowledge. It is our job to bring provocative voices to the forefront, and in addition to focusing on national events, we want to be sure to highlight various aspects of local history. Information included in the mainstream media has historically been told through an overwhelmingly white male lens. To combat this, some have taken initiative to report their own realities. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Ida B. Wells took control, countered false narratives, and chronicled the realities of lynchings and uprisings during her time. A century later, the African American community is still impacted by racial inequality and state sanctioned violence. Tonight, we are honored to host Michelle Duster as she makes the connections between her paternal great grandmother, Ida B. Wells, and her pioneering data journalism career, and how that tradition contributes to today's truth and justice movement. Tonight's program will run for about 90 minutes, which includes a presentation and a discussion and about a 15-minute Q&A. For your convenience, you can submit your questions through the Q&A button, which is found on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We would prefer for you to wait until the end to ask your questions, but please know if we do not get to all of them, we will try our very best to acknowledge as many as we can. At this time, I'm going to introduce our speaker and kick off our presentation for the evening. Michelle Duster is a writer, speaker, professor, and champion of racial and gender equity. She has initiated and supported dozens of local, state, and national initiatives to have street names, markers, murals, and monuments to honor her paternal great grandmother, Ida B. Wells, and other African American female historic figures. She has worked on PBS documentary films and organized several film festivals in the last dozen years. She has written articles for Essence, Huffington Post, Teen Vogue, and the North Star. Additionally, she has written and edited or contributed to over 11 books. She co edited Shifts, an anthology of women's growth through change, and co wrote the popular children's history book, Tate and His Historic Dream, and edited two books that include the writings of Ida B. Wells, Ida in Her Own Words, and Ida from Abroad. Her most recent book that she co edited is Michelle Obama's Impact on African American Women and Girls. Michelle was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. She earned her BA in psychology from Dartmouth College and her MA in Media Studies from the New School in New York City. She also completed MFA coursework in film and video production at Columbia College in Chicago. She has received numerous awards, including the 2019 Multi-Generational Activist Award from the Illinois Human Rights Commission and the 2019 Martin Luther King Jr. Social Justice Award from Dartmouth College. She teaches and tutors writing at the college level and currently working on 4 books, which will be published within the next 2 years. Impact, Personal Portraits of Activism, that she co-edited with Trina Sotara, will be published in September 2020. The book Ida B. the Queen, about the life and legacy of her great-grandmother, will be released on January 26, 2021. She has 2 children's picture books that will also be released in 2022. At this time, I would like to hand over the floor to our guest speaker for the evening, Ms. Michelle Duster.
Hi, Shakia. Thank you so much for that introduction. Wow. I'm honored to be here tonight and hopefully can share some information that people will find interesting. We're going to be talking about my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, and today's street journalism and the connection between the work that she did and what is happening today. Okay, so just so you, in case you, I'm assuming most people know who my great-grandmother was, but just to give a quick overview of, she was extremely multi-dimensional. So just to give a brief overview of her life story or her journey, she started her career as a teacher, and then she segued into journalism. And one thing I like to point out as far as her journalism career was that she started off writing for church newspapers and then grew into writing for actual newspapers, and then she became a co-owner and editor of a newspaper. She is well known for being an anti-lynching crusader, which was part of her data journalism that she's really well known for. She also is considered to be a civil rights activist because she used journalism as a form of activism in order to expose the truth about what was going on regarding lynching. And so she used journalism as a tool to fight against the powers that be. She also ultimately ended up being a co-founder of the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women. And that segued into her being a suffragist, where she fought for the right to vote. She's founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, and she started working more locally in Chicago as a community organizer, social worker, and she worked in housing to help migrants get a fair shake at actually being successful in Chicago. So that's just kind of a brief overview of all of the things that my great-grandmother did. But we're going to be talking today mostly about her work in journalism. And just so you understand how I'm related to her, Ida B. Wells married my great-grandfather, whose name was Ferdinand Barnett, and she hyphenated her name to Wells Barnett. She had 4 children, and my grandmother, Alfreda Barnett, was her youngest child. My grandmother had 5 children, and my father, Donald Duster, was her middle child. And then my father had 3 children, and I'm the oldest of the 3 children. So there's a picture of myself with my brothers, David and Daniel. So that's how I am related to Ida B. Wells, through my father. So just to give an example of how impactful my great-grandmother's work was, here in this year in 2020, she was honored with a Pulitzer Prize special citation for her outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. This is historic because she was one of 7 African Americans to win the special citation in the 104 years that the Pulitzer Prize has existed. And she's the first African American to win that prize in journalism. I mean, the special citation in journalism. So even posthumously, she is making history. So we're going to explore why her work was so impactful. In the next slide. Well, so the difference between, well, the definition of street or citizen journalism, and this is my personal definition, is that it tends to cover local or community news. So you have people that are inside of their own community reporting about what's going on right there where they live or associate themselves with. It's on the ground reporting, so it's up close and personal type of reporting on things that are happening in their personal world. It includes details or perspective that usually is not covered in mainstream outlets, because a lot of times, especially today, the mainstream outlets, it's, especially with all the consolidation that's happened in the journalism world, there is not as much resources for people to cover local news. So a lot of it tends to be covered by just one outlet, and then it's kind of reproduced around the country. So you just don't have that sort of local and personal approach to stories. Now, the thing about specifically African American experience in this country when it comes to how our stories are being told, there is a little bit of a parallel between how my great-grandmother decided to take control over the stories and what is happening in the more recent years. Just to give a few examples of the things that my great-grandmother covered, in 1908 was the Springfield, Illinois riot, which was part of what spurred the creation of the NAACP, because it was a riot that took place in the land of Lincoln, in the hometown that is associated with Abraham Lincoln. So that was alarming, and so people felt the need to examine what's going on with the racial tension in our country. In 1917, as you know, there was a riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, which the mainstream media covered as something, of course, that African Americans instigated, and were sort of almost blaming us for our own demise, when in fact there was state-sanctioned violence against the African American community. There was a lot of murders and property damage that was inflicted on the Black community by people who were associated with the power structure. And then 1919, the Red Summer, there were riots in multiple cities around the country. And my great-grandmother covered what happened in Chicago. And then that same year, there was a major massacre that happened in Elaine, Arkansas. My great-grandmother wrote pamphlets about all of these riots. And then more recently, I'm guessing most of us remember what happened in Los Angeles with the Rodney King uprising. And then more recently, what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and then Baltimore, and then now in 2020 with the aftermath of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor murders. So all of these situations, there's a local covering of these incidents that tell a different story by the people who are part of the community that's being assaulted versus the power structure that wants to tell a different narrative. So those are the similarities between then and now. My great-grandmother's take on mainstream journalism, and this is an excerpt from the pamphlet that she wrote in 1893 that was distributed at the World's Fair in Chicago. She says that they belong to the race which holds Negro life cheap, which own the telegraph wires, newspapers, and all other communication with the outside world. They write the reports which justify lynching by painting the Negro as black as possible. And those reports are accepted by the press associations in the world without question or investigation. And I thought that was important to point out because she wrote this in 1893. And what she's talking about is how the people who own the media outlets are the ones who tend to tell the stories. And the stories that tend to be told from that perspective are not really telling it from the African American point of view. And as a result of that, our stories tend to be skewed and tend to be told from a negative point of view. And that's what she's talking about in 1893, and I actually think is true today. So I just thought that would be interesting for people to see how she was sort of recognizing and criticizing the mainstream journalism and in building a case on why street journalism and data journalism is important, because it tells a different story than what is told through the mainstream media. The narratives that my great-grandmother was countering at the time of her life was mostly what she was focusing was how the narrative was about specifically Black men violating white women in sexual ways. And that was the narrative that was being told in order to justify literally murdering Black men. Now, there were some Black women who were killed as well. And so that was not the only narrative that was being told, but it was the predominant narrative that to justify, and the reality of the situation was that a lot of the men who were killed, and this is what she found through her investigation, and what she was doing was she would go to the site of lynching that occurred and interview people in that area and ask them, you know, point blank, personal ways of chronicling what actually happened. And what she found out time and time again was that the great majority of the time, there was no rape that occurred, there was no violation of white women, but there were petty crimes that might have occurred, or there were false allegations. And if there was some kind of a liaison that happened between white women and Black men, most of the time it was consensual. And when their liaison was discovered, then the white woman would cry rape. But it wasn't that, I mean, she was involved in the liaison willingly. So my great-grandmother uncovered that this narrative was being told over and over in order to justify the literal murder of Black men. And what's happening today when it comes to state-sanctioned violence, the narrative that's constantly being told is that Black men are engaging in some kind of criminal or suspicious or threatening or aggressive way. We hear that in different types of ways of being told, but that's ultimately what is being said. Or when somebody is killed in police custody, a lot of times we hear this narrative that they were resisting arrest, or they were acting in a way that it seemed like they might have had a weapon. And then with Black women, you know, it's kind of the same thing, where they were threatening, or they were sassy, or they were somehow doing something that justifies this type of violence that is being inflicted on our community disproportionately. So some of the crimes that my great-grandmother found, the real crimes that people were guilty of, if they were guilty of a crime, or some of the crimes that they were saying was rape, attempted rape, alleged rape, suspicion of rape, murder, alleged complicity in murder, murderous assault, attempted murder, attempted robbery, arson, incendiarism, alleged stock poisoning, poisoning wells, alleged poisoning wells, burglary, wife beating, self-defense, suspected robbery, assault and battery, insulting white, malpractice, alleged barn burning, stealing, unknown offense, no offense, or race prejudice. And so what she did was time and time again, and it's in a Red Record, which is a pamphlet that she published in 1895. She also chronicled in Southern Horrors, which was published in 1892. You know, how many crimes happened, where they took place, the names of the people who were killed, the dates, all of that. And that's what is today known as data journalism. And so she has literal numbers of all of these crimes that were used to justify lynching. I just took what she wrote and put only the reasons, but she actually has the numbers. And today we are dealing with some of the crimes that are being used as excuses for state-sanctioned violence, which is on the next slide. If these are excuses, but these are some of the reasons why people are calling the police on Black people, which are the same sort of innocuous type of reasons that might have been used during my great-grandmother's time, which today we hear about it was sleeping while Black, walking while Black, resisting arrest, jogging, having a mental breakdown. We've heard of stories of people that said they were accused of having a gun, but they were really holding a wallet, or they were holding something else that somebody said looked like a gun. They were reaching for a gun, they were wearing a hoodie, and they looked suspicious. In the case of the Starbucks, people calling the police on the Starbucks, they were waiting to start a meeting. They were selling loosies. I'm sure for some of you this is very familiar. And then most recently with George Floyd, they were using a counterfeit $20 bill. So these are all of the crimes that people, and these are just a short list of some of the crimes that people were accused of in order to justify calling the police on them. And then things escalated when the police arrived. So one of the things that my great-grandmother did, in addition to writing about what was going on regarding lynching and the realities, and exposing all of the rationale that was being used to literally murder people. And what she found was that some of the people who were literally committing the crimes were part of the justice system. They were the sheriff, they were the judges, some of them were attorneys, and people in the community knew who they were. And one of the ways I saw actually an exhibit that said some people in the community could tell who these people were based on their shoes, because sometimes they did have on disguises or whatever. But then obviously things became more bold, and in broad daylight, people were murdered in sometimes almost a carnival-like situation where it was advertised in the paper for people to come watch the lynching. So in addition to chronicling what was going on, my great-grandmother decided to actually own the newspaper. She became a co-owner of several newspapers. And then when she decided to do more extensive reporting and write more in-depth investigations of what was happening, she decided to do that in the form of pamphlets. And she did that in an independent way by crowdfunding. And then she self-published the pamphlets. And I think this is important to recognize that with her owning the newspapers and the pamphlets, that gave her the freedom to write and publish what she felt was important without having to be censored or have somebody else decide if it was important enough to publish or if the information needed to be tempered in any way. And so I think ownership is very important when it comes to having the ability to tell certain stories. And today's journalists are taking ownership in a different way. We have the right, we have the cell phones now, so people are filming and uploading their own videos onto social media platforms. We're writing stories from our own perspectives and putting it into blogs and podcasts, websites, and like I already mentioned, YouTube channels. And so this is our way of sort of circumventing the filters that can sort of create barriers when it comes to other forms of, or other distribution channels of our stories. So the newspapers that my great-grandmother co-owned were the Memphis Free Speech. And then after she got run out of Memphis, she went up to New York City and she became a partial owner of the New York Age with T. Thomas Fortune. And then when she moved to Chicago, she became full owner of the Conservator newspaper, which actually was owned by her husband, and for whatever reason he decided to sell it to her. So there were 3 different newspapers that she actually had partial or full ownership of during her lifetime, which was extremely unusual for a Black person at that time. But then on top of that, being a woman, just made it incredible that she actually managed to do this. And then the pamphlets that she wrote, this is the list of the full pamphlets. In 1892, when she was only 30 years old, she published Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases. And I can go into a whole lot of detail about all of these maybe in the Q&A. In 1893, she published The Reason Why the Colored American, Colored American is not in the World's Columbian Exposition. In 1895, she published A Red Record, and in 1899, Lynch Law in Georgia. 1900, Mob Rule in New Orleans. 1917, the East St. Louis Massacre, and then 1920, the Arkansas riot. So she was very busy, and obviously she felt a need to constantly publish this information in order to tell a story at that time about what was going on. But I think we all should feel privileged that she was managed to do this, because she left behind a record for us today to see what was going on, a firsthand chronicle document of what was happening during that time. I think what's happening today makes street journalism particularly important, because it's not a secret at this point that newsrooms and mainstream media are, there's racial inequity in these spaces. So 40% of the US population are racial and ethnic minorities, which means that 60% are white. But then you have, in these newsrooms, only 25% of the employees are people of color. So you can see the disparity. We make up 40% of the population, but only 25% of the employees. And that is compared to 34% of all US workers. And so 50% of the newsroom staff are white men, compared to 33% of the overall workforce. So you can see that within newsrooms, it's just predominantly white. And that is out of proportion to our population in this country. So what data journalism does is interviews people on the ground locally in that particular geographical space. And what my great-grandmother did, and what I think is important today, is to collect detailed information, which means collecting dates, names. What she did was calculate the money and property loss. She chronicled what the accusations were and the timelines. So it's not just making broad statements about what the problems are, but just it's almost like you're building a legal document in order to sort of build a case. So she compiled the information into a comprehensive report kind of document. And then what she did was she would send it to authorities who could impact change. So her target audience wasn't necessarily the general public, although it was to an extent, but it was more to impact policy and then to impact change. And in order to do that, so she truly believed that the truth would help dispel the narratives at that time and ultimately impact policy and laws. And that was the purpose and the point of the work that she was doing. And I think that's important to do today, because it's one thing to say that our communities are under assault, and that's a vague kind of term, but if you have numbers and names and frequency and all of that kind of stuff, then it really does build a case. So what my great-grandmother did and what today's street journalists are doing is countering the false narratives that predominate the mainstream media. And in order to counter those false narratives, you actually need facts, statistics, and firsthand accounts, which means interviewing people on the ground and getting their firsthand stories of what actually is going on a personal level. And then if you have control over those news outlets, and distribute them independently, then it's possible to sort of skirt around the sort of gatekeepers that there are in the mainstream media. And then you use the information in order to impact attitudes, have an impact on laws and policies. And that is the tradition that my great-grandmother was working in. And I think that's the most effective way that today's street journalists can use their work. So here we are. My great-grandmother was born in 1862 and she died in 1931. So she lived for almost 70 years, and she was working to combat false narratives for almost 50 years out of her life. She died in 1931, which is almost 90 years ago. And it's just amazing that we are dealing with almost 2 different centuries, but we have some of the same issues. We're still dealing with racial inequality when it comes to social issues. Unfortunately, that's just our reality. We're still dealing with stereotypes and mischaracterizations of African American people. We still are dealing with violence that is perpetuated and sanctioned by the state. And then the other thing that is a commonality between now and what my great-grandmother was dealing with was how white women are using the state in order to combat what they want to view as a fear, and using white tears, as we call it today, to ultimately sort of inflict violence on us. During my great-grandmother's time, there was the false accusations of Black men raping white women, or somehow assaulting or violating or threatening them in some kind of way. And that ultimately led to murder of Black people. And we're dealing with some of that same kind of weaponization of fear of Black people on the behalf of white women to call the police on us. And this idea that white women feel the need or the right to police public spaces and use their sort of fear of Black people as a way to call the state against us has been prevalent. And I think with the cell phones, now people are starting to videotape it and actually see enough of it. So now there are some states and local municipalities that have introduced this idea of a Karen Act, which the acronym is the Caution Against Racially Exploitative Non-Emergencies Act, which as far as I know, I'm not sure if it's actually gone into law in any specific places, but I know that it's being discussed in some areas to penalize people specifically, I guess, well, it's mostly white women, but anybody who wants to use the police and calling the police on innocuous kind of behaviors in order to, which ultimately puts Black people's lives in danger. So hopefully we can get to that point in our country where the weaponization of the state against Black people for not doing anything criminal can actually go into law and protect us a little bit more. So to summarize, hopefully, you know, we can you know, see the parallels between what was happening during my great-grandmother's lifetime, which was over 100 years ago, and what is happening today, because we as a country, I mean, we do live in one country, and one of the things I want to leave you with is a quote that my great-grandmother said, which a lot of people can relate to today, which is, people must know before they can act, and there is no educator to compare with the press. She said that over 100 years ago, and I think that is applicable today because people need her to affect change. And sometimes we are the ones who need to be in charge of educating people because they are miseducated through some of the mainstream media outlets.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we are going to open the floor up for questions. So if you have any questions, please just type them in the Q&A toolbar and we will get right to the question portion. Michelle, while we wait, is there anything else that you would like to mention before we jump into the Q&A?
No, not off the top of my head. I think it'd be helpful for me to know what people are interested in hearing more about.
Okay. Okay, so we have a question from Diane. Can you tell us about Ida B. Wells' work with Frederick Douglass?
Yes, Frederick Douglass was, he's the reason why my great-grandmother actually came to Chicago, because he invited her to help him write this pamphlet called The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition, which was a way to protest the lack of representation and involvement of African Americans in the World's Columbian Exposition in a way that he personally felt was applicable. At that time, it was 30 years after the Civil War ended, and the feeling was that African Americans had contributed a lot to this country, and it wasn't really being exhibited in the World's Fair. So he invited her to come to Chicago to work on that in 1893. And so she ultimately ended up staying in Chicago because there were 4 contributors to that pamphlet. It was my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, Irvine Garland Penn, and Ferdinand Barnett. And my great-grandmother's last name was Wells Barnett. So, so Ferdinand and Barnett and my great-grandmother got to know each other while they were working on that pamphlet. So in my family, we kind of have a joke that, you know, that Frederick Douglass was like, you know, he's the one that introduced our great-grandparents to each other. So that's how they worked together. They had met before, I think it was in 1889 at a newspaper convention, a Black newspaper convention, And so he knew about her for a few years before he actually asked her to come to Chicago. And he was the one that encouraged her to go to do the speaking tour in the United Kingdom. They originally asked him to go, but then he encouraged Ida to go instead of him, because he knew that she was the one that could tell the story in more detail. So they knew each other pretty well. He was kind of like a mentor to her.
Thank you for that. And Marianne Tipton, she would like for you to reread the quote that you just read. She said her screen froze and she really wants to be able to hear it.
Okay. The people must know before they can act, and there is no educator to compare with the press.
Thank you. And also, you just talked about the pamphlets. We have a question here. What is the best source for seeing the pamphlets?
I think it's digitized at this point. So the name of the pamphlet is "The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition." So if you Google that, you probably can find it. It is digitized at this point, so you can find it online. But I'm going to give myself a plug too, because I reproduced the Ida's section of the pamphlet in my first book, Ida in Her Own Words, before it was digitized.
So,
about what's going on today compared to what was going on during our time.
Okay, and Linda S. would like for you to talk about Ida B. Wells' work with the women's suffrage movement.
Right. Well, my great-grandmother was involved in the suffrage movement. She was involved in the club, and there was a women's club movement before she really, I guess, got as involved in the suffrage movement as she did. But part of what Black women were doing within the club movement was working on the idea of voting rights and suffrage for women. But she became more involved in 1913 when in the state of Illinois gave partial suffrage to women. And so my great-grandmother formed the Alpha Suffrage Club shortly after that in order for Black women to just dive right in and start registering Black women to vote for municipal. Partial suffrage in Illinois was women could vote for presidential candidates and for municipal candidates, but for some reason they couldn't vote for statewide. So she got busy registering Black women to vote on the municipal level to have control over our own local government. And she participated in the parade in 1913, right before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And that's a really famous scene where she refused to march in the back of the parade when they requested that Black women do so. And she ultimately inserted herself into the Illinois delegation, right alongside her white counterparts.
Thank you. So this next question has a few parts. The first part is, how would Ida B. Wells gather her information?
Well, on several occasions, she literally went to the scene where crimes had occurred. For instance, in East St. Louis, Illinois, when there was that big riot in 1917, she got on a train from Chicago and went down to East St. Louis, I think the day after the riot happened. And she walked around in the streets and interviewed individual people one by one and asked them to tell their particular stories. And then in the pamphlet that she wrote about the riot, she summarizes individual people's stories of what actually occurred. And afterwards, she tallied the amount of the financial loss that people had and sort of put it all together. And and then she ultimately, produced the pamphlet and distributed it to some lawmakers because she wanted justice for the level of loss, both of life and property. So she literally was on the ground. She did the same thing for Elaine, Arkansas. She literally went to Elaine and talked to people, and got their stories up close and personal. In some situations, like with lynch law in Georgia, and mob rule in New Orleans, she hired private detectives and to go down there, white men, to go to these places and talk to people and give her the reports. So she knew it was too dangerous for her to go there herself, but she knew it was okay for a white man to go around poking around. But in all situations, she was getting firsthand stories of what actually happened.
Well, you kind of answered the second part. She also wanted to know, how did she hear from everyone involved?
Yeah, I think I did. I mean,
Yeah.
she went into the neighborhoods, into the situation, right? And she was warned, in multiple times to not go to these places because it was so dangerous. But she went in anyway. And I mean, in this case of like in Arkansas, she disguised herself and went into the prison where the men were in prison. They were on death row. And she went in there and it disguised herself as the aunt of one of the men, and got their story firsthand, from them, because she was right there talking to them. And then she wrote the pamphlet that night because she couldn't take notes while she was in the prison because she had to act like she was just visiting them. But she talks about how she did that, and so it was just very interesting. She literally talked to people firsthand, person to person, on what happened.
And you also touched on this a little bit, but speaking to her reporting on East St. Louis as an example of alternative journalism, can you tell us a little bit more about what it was like for her to report on East St. Louis during that time?
Well, I mean, I've read her pamphlet, and she talks about, they heard about the riot in Chicago. She was living in Chicago at the time, and immediately was like, well, I have to go down there and investigate what happened. And so she hopped on a train and went to East St. Louis. And she talks about how when she decided to get off the train conductor told her, um, I'm not sure this is a good idea for you to do this. This is really dangerous. And are you sure you want to get off there? Are you in the right place? And she was like, yeah, I'm definitely going to get off here. So then she describes in the pamphlet what it was like, where the streets were deserted. There a lot of, things were burned, and she was kind of literally walking through the streets. In a situation where there were still some people there who were armed, and so she could tell that it was dangerous. But then so many people had escaped from East St. Louis and went and gone over to St. Louis, in order to escape the violence. So then she ended up going over to St. Louis, and in these almost like, it was kind of almost like refugee camps, if you want to call it that, because there were so many people that had escaped. And so she literally went into these spaces and talked to people one by one of what exactly they had experienced. And then she chronicled it in the pamphlet of one story after another of people, just talking about how people had come into their homes and destroyed everything, set their houses on fire, and killed people as they were running away. I mean, it's harrowing to read that pamphlet, but she's very descriptive in her writing, and she profiles individual people. I would say it's maybe about 15 stories that she chronicles, and so you get a very vivid sense of the level of devastation, the level of violence. And then she talks about how the state was part of it, where the people who were part of basically kind of like the National Guard stood aside and watched people, you know, inflict this kind of violence and didn't do anything to stop it.
Thank you for that, Michelle. Okay, so we have another one. How did Ida finance her activities? That's a good one.
Well, again, it was crowdfunding. She was really good, I guess, at, you know, mostly going into churches. And a lot of times it was women's groups in the churches. That's how she financed almost all of her pamphlets, especially the Southern Horrors pamphlet, because she was in New York, and there were the women's clubs in New York welcomed her. She had written a series of articles in the New York Age, and then she wanted to convert it into a pamphlet. And so there were women in New York that were enthralled with what she was doing, and so they sort of, you know, basically, in my opinion, it was like they passed the hat, you know, kind of thing, in the churches, and, you know, collected money in order to fund the production of her pamphlets. And she did that time and time again. So it was, you know, in my opinion, kind of like the early way of, you know, GoFundMe or whatever kind of, you know, crowdfunding that she did. It was a lot of people giving a small amount of money to be part of what she was doing. And I mean, in almost every case, when even after she had the Negro Fellowship League in 1910, and that was before she wrote the pamphlet about the East St. Louis riot and Elaine, Arkansas. All of those were funded through the Negro Fellowship League, which had, you know, people who were supportive of the league, and so they would take up collections.
Okay. Was she ever arrested?
No.
No. Wow.
No, but she was threatened. She was threatened several times. You know, I mean, that's why she never went back to Memphis, because her life was threatened in such a graphic way. I mean, if you read the kind of things that were said about her, if they were going to tie her to a stake and put brands on her face and, you know, cut off limbs. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff that was literally printed in the newspapers of what they were going to do to her. And so, you know, she realized maybe it's a good idea for me to not go back there. So yeah, I mean, she was threatened, not only in the newspapers, but even in person before she left Memphis. The people from the streetcar company went to her newspaper office and told her to her face that if she didn't stop publishing the articles that which was encouraging people to boycott white-owned businesses and the streetcars, they didn't say they would kill her. They just said, you better stop or else, you know. I mean, so you don't have to be a genius to figure out that's a threat. So she was a proponent of defending herself, and she vowed to herself that she wouldn't go out alone if somebody tried to actually harm her. So she was not trying to stop, but she was like, okay, bring it, you know. But she was never arrested. She was just threatened.
So here's another question. How closely engaged was Ida with Zora Neale Hurston and other folks documenting the stories of the Black experience?
I have never read anything that shows that that Ida and Zora interacted with each other. So I can only go by what she chronicled her own life in her autobiography, and then everything I've read written by other people about Ida, I have not seen that they knew or interacted with each other. That doesn't mean that they didn't, but it just wasn't documented in any way that I've seen. But she definitely interacted with other people that are well known as far as more sort of, I guess, the civil rights leaders of her time, which were Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, William Monroe Trotter, T. Thomas Fortune. She knew Madam C.J. Walker, who was a big philanthropist when it came to, supporting a lot of her initiatives. Mary Church, she was involved with the National Association of Colored Women, so she knew Mary McLeod Bethune and Mary Church Terrell, and it was Harriet Tubman was at the first meeting for the National Association of Colored Women. And there's a famous story of how Harriet Tubman held up my grandmother's brother. He was an infant with her. And so they were like the oldest and the youngest people who were at the original meeting. So they definitely interacted with each other. There were, I could just have a long list of like Fannie Berrier Williams and other women who were involved in the club women's movement or the suffrage movement. So, those are the people that I'm most familiar with that she interacted with. They were more kind of in the civil rights, if you want to call it the civil rights movement of that time, more so than the literary world.
Well, we talked earlier about what it was like to grow up being a descendant of Ida B. Wells. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I am related to Ida through my father. Ida B. Wells was my father's grandmother. And my father's mother was Ida's youngest daughter. So I knew my grandmother very well. Luckily, I grew up with her, and she passed away when I was in college. So all of my childhood, I did have the chance to interact with my grandmother and her sister, both of Ida's daughters. And so for me, growing up related to Ida was normal. I didn't know anything different. And I think it surprises a lot of people to know that in my family, my grandmother was very deliberate about helping us meaning I'm one of 15 grandchildren of my grandmother. And so helping us know who my great grandmother was and what she did. But my grandmother was very deliberate about making it so that we had our own identity, our own sense of identity, and we didn't, and I think she was deliberate about making sure that we didn't feel pressure to live up to somebody else's accomplishments or compare ourselves to her. That kind of pressure came from outside of the family. But within our family, my grandmother was very much focused on us as her grandchildren. And so she was very involved as far as, coming to our little recitals and our graduations. We were a normal family. We had birthday parties and, holidays and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't all about my great grandmother. So from my perspective, our life was normal. To me, it wasn't very different than any of my friends. The only thing that was slightly different was that every once in a while we would have to go to events, where my great grandmother was being inducted into a Hall of Fame or part of an exhibit or things like that. So we would go to the event and then go back home and play Monopoly or something. It was just something to do, but it didn't dominate our lives.
Okay, we have a few more questions here, but I want to be cognizant of time. Did she publish any of Paul Laurence Dunbar's work in her newspapers?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't. I haven't seen every page of all of her newspapers, but I think she was mostly focused on more social issues than poetry. In fact, I mean, you know, Paul Laurence Dunbar was one of the few African Americans who participated in the World's Fair. And so he recited, you know, one of his poems, or maybe more than one of his poems there. But my great grandmother had decided to not attend that one colored day that they had for the World's Fair. So she even missed that. But she heard about it and, you know, realized that it was something that maybe she should have supported. But I mean, I can only go by what she talked about and what other people have talked about. So there might have been something she did that I don't know about, but she certainly didn't mention reproducing any of his work in her newspapers.
We have time for one more question. And this is an interesting one. Did Ida B. Wells travel west to document some of the racial uprisings that were happening on the West Coast?
She traveled all over the country to speak to people about what was happening regarding lynching in general. So she didn't specifically document what was happening in the West. Mostly what she was documenting was in the South, but she did have numbers of how many lynchings that had taken place in almost every state. But her speaking, when she did her speaking tours that were mostly in 1894 and 1895, she went, I mean, it was just amazing. And when you consider that she was traveling by train everywhere, it was nothing like today's kind of travel, and she was everywhere. She spoke for almost a year. And it's funny because, like, one of the things in our family that's kind of a joke is Ferdinand, I guess, proposed to her 3 times before she said yes.
Oh.
And then she is the one who kept moving the date of the actual wedding because she was so busy, you know, doing her speaking tours. Because they ultimately got married in 1895, but she had been speaking up until like 3 days, I think, before the wedding. So she was just like, yeah, I'll get married to you, but I, you know, have other things I need to take care of first. So she was super busy. It's amazing the schedule that she kept up.
Well, thank you, Michelle Duster, for sharing your expertise with us this evening. Do you have any final thoughts? I did want to acknowledge one of our virtual visitors, Deborah Hatfield. She sent over an image of a signed copy of Crusade for Justice, which was signed by your grandmother that I shared with you a few weeks ago.
Oh,
but
wow.
I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged her because I see that she is on the call. So thank you so much for the excitement and how excited you are about this presentation and for sharing that image with us.
Oh yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's always amazing to me to see how many people have met anybody in my family, you know, but especially my grandmother, because my grandmother passed away in 1983. So, you know, for anybody who met her, I mean, I guess that's also sort of living history that you got a chance to meet her.
Yeah, and it's dated November 26, 1975. So thank you.
Wow, so that was only 5 years after the book was published.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
I could add just a little bit as far as my grandmother, as far as what it took for her to get the book published. Okay. My grandmother, okay, so my great-grandmother, Ida, died in 1931, and her autobiography was published in 1970. So do the math, it's almost 40 years. And so my grandmother had 5 children, as I mentioned before, and so it took her a while in between being a mother to edit her mother's work. And then it took a while for her to find a publisher that was willing to publish an autobiography. During the 1960s, my grandmother was looking for a publisher to publish an autobiography of somebody who was considered militant, extreme, difficult, during the 1960s. And so luckily, you know, University of Chicago Press was brave enough to do that with their Negro Heritage series that was edited by John Hope Franklin. But it took my grandmother a while. I mean, you talk about, tenacity. It's really a miracle that my great grandmother's book was edited and published, because it wasn't easy to get that done.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. And it looks like Deborah said thank you so much for mentioning it. You are welcome very much. Again, I would like to thank our guest panelist for this evening, Michelle Duster. Thank you again for answering the call, for sharing your expertise, and for just shedding light and connecting the dots between your great grandmother's work and what we are seeing today. So, thank you so very much. For those of you who are experiencing How Did We Get Here for the first time, we would like to invite you to participate in a 30-minute uncensored community conversation with guided facilitators. This space is created for you to process and reflect upon tonight's dialogue in a community setting. If you are interested, please click the link that will be posted in the chat box. And I will keep this page open for about 3 minutes before we transition to the community conversation piece. If you are interested in supporting MHS through a membership, we would be grateful to have your support. Please copy and paste the link into your browser. You can visit us at mohistory.org for more information. And also, lastly, Kobo Toolbox survey should have popped up as soon as you opened your browser. Please, please, please take that survey for us and let us know how you felt about this evening's program, or how you felt about the entire How Did We Get Here series. Again, thank you all for joining us this evening. Michelle, deep bow to you. Thank you so much for participating in this series and for ending it on such a strong note. Thank you everyone for joining us. And for those of you that will join the community conversations piece, I will see you over in the next chat in about 5 minutes. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me, Shaki.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Missouri Historical Society. This is so important, and I'm so happy that you're doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you again. And Michelle, you're more than welcome to join us if you'd like to come over and just peek into the conversation. But I know you've been talking for quite some time, and it is dinner time, so it's totally up to you.
Thank you.
You are welcome. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you over in the other Zoom chat. Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay. Yeah. Hold on. All I'm doing is oh, I feel like